feature presentation.
The year was 2021. It was the Toronto International Film Festival. A weird Toronto International Film Festival. It was one in the middle of a pandemic, after a canceled TIFF the year before, or a fully digital one. I forget what the hell happened. I can't believe COVID's been like 4 years ago, but it's still going on and all this stuff.
It'll never go away, Matt.
A young, spry Eric Marchin and a young, even
Young.
sprier Matt Rohrbeck sat down in Theater 12 of Scotiabank Theater, social distancing with masks on. It was September the 11th, 2021. And we sat and watched Denis Villeneuve's Dune. Some know it as Dune Part 1.
Or they're going to say some people know him as Denis Villeneuve.
And we sat and watched Dune Part 1 for the first time. A little bit of context. Both Eric and I, huge fans of Denis Villeneuve. Eric, a fan of Dune and has seen the David Lynch version, knows more about Dune than I. I'm going in not knowing anything about Dune, but really like Denis Villeneuve. It was one of the most anticipated films of the year. It was one of the most anticipated films of the film festival. It was playing in IMAX at Scotiabank, so it was full frame. A lot of things going into it. We got out of that screening, and we're in the small minority that did not like the film at all.
We didn't Dune the Dune.
We reviewed the film. Probably infamously the most hate we've gotten online since we started this show, and since you were on Rotten Tomatoes and the YouTube video and on Twitter and things like that. Infamously got kind of it's all opinions, it's all subjective, but people get passionate about these things.
Well, people also forget that it is subjective.
Yeah. But we were Dune haters. We were Dune Part 1 haters. I will say that. So the day today, not to date this, but it is February 27th, 2024. I am about a week removed of seeing Dune Part 2. Eric has seen the movie twice now. I have rewatched Dune Part 1. I have appeared on the Kind of Funny In Review podcast.
You're recycling jokes from that podcast on here. How dare you, sir?
Hey, I didn't do the complete same thing. I'm just kind of giving context to everyone. And what do we think now? You might be surprised.
Well, we buckled under the pressure and we're cowards.
Today we are reviewing Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2. We will be doing this completely spoiler-free since the film has only really had one showing. They had that IMAX fan first screening on Sunday night, which Eric did attend, and then we both saw the press screening at the Scotiabank IMAX about a week ago. So we'll be going, if you don't want to know anything about Dune, if you've managed to avoid spoilers for 60 years since the novel came out, and don't want to know anything, you probably shouldn't be listening or watching anything about Dune before you see the movie. But we are going to keep it vague and spoiler free for this impressions. And then if you want my full spoiler filled thoughts, please go watch Part 1 on In Review over on Kind of Funny podcast services or YouTube. But I will be back for a Dune Part 2 review with them this Friday, which will be, what's the date on Friday?
March 1st.
March 1st. Yeah, March 1st on Friday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 p.m. Pacific, if you're a Kind of Funny member on Patreon or YouTube. And then it'll be up on podcast services and YouTube everywhere after that. But this will be spoiler free. So Eric, I mentioned that we were haters of the first Dune.
Yep.
We've both revisited the first film. I know people are tuning into this because they want to know our Part 2 thoughts.
Dune?
Let's briefly, just very briefly, you guys might have seen my Twitter. You might have listened to the Kind of Funny review already. I've done a complete 180 on Dune, where I went from a hater. I am, man. I'm a coward. I'm a man of the people, man. Mainstream Matt. I rewatched Dune the day before we saw Dune Part 2. And I I said this, that a lot goes into, seeing a movie for the first time, seeing it at a film festival, these kind of things. And especially a movie as dense as Dune, or like a sci-fi that's as heady and dense as Dune, where I went in not knowing the world. And that movie is a lot of exposition and world building and a lot of character names and a lot of politics and different things going on, religion, all this kind of stuff, and double crossing and playing in the shadows and all this kind of stuff that I didn't grasp it the first time, and I didn't get it the first time. I obviously understood its scope. The score is incredible, and like the IMAX cinematography and all that kind of stuff from a technical level. Never It's kind of like my feelings on Mad Max Fury Road, where I never argue the technical accomplishment of that movie, but there was something lacking, and I think it was that both of us aren't really fans of the half movie, right? Like when you split a novel in half and you end it at a certain point, it feels a little bit incomplete, and then you have to wait years to get the second half. So it really feels like two parts of a whole. So it's hard to even review a first half. But when I rewatched it, knowing I was getting part two the next morning, and now I'm not giving excuses for the movie, but seeing it a second time as well, which I think certain movies do deserve a second watch after your expectations are gone, after you sort of understand the story, but you're able to focus on some of the more nuanced or intricate or complicated elements of its story. And I found myself, understanding everyone's motivations, connecting with the characters a lot more, understanding what the Bene Gesserit were up to, what the Harkonnens wanted, what the Emperor wanted, what Atreides and Leto wanted, and everything this time, where I was just locked the fuck in, and I understood what was happening. I was intrigued by what's happening, and I was excited for the future. So I've done a complete 180 on the movie, and then I was very excited to see part two, which we'll talk about in a moment. Eric,
you're a Mohadib of the people, Max.
There you go. Exactly. A voice from the outer world as well. So your experience slightly different, where you went into Dune Part 2 without rewatching the first film, and then you've gone back and watched David Lynch's Dune, Dune Part 1, and now Dune Part 2 a second time. So before we go into Part 2, Eric, how is that rewatch for you, kind of bookending it with Part 2 and first watch and second watch? You're still mixed on it, you said, right?
Yeah, so okay, I equate this to a game of chess, what Denis Villeneuve is doing here.
Yeah.
When it comes to anything, whether it's a sport or a hobby, you ultimately, or video games, you ultimately want to be playing yourself. You don't want to be watching. So the next best thing, if you can't play the game or you can't interact with what you're viewing yourself, is to see the game actually being played. And Dune Part 1 is essentially watching somebody take a chessboard, set it up, put all the pieces on the table, and then explain what each piece is, and then
make their first
move, and being like, oh,
I'll see
ran out of time, see you in a couple years. And that's what Dune Part 1 is. Yeah. I still feel that way, except I appreciate the setup more, just in terms of what it gives for Part 2, the runway for Part 2. So the progression in plot in Part 2, I think, is what really drives home why that half of the film is more successful. I also think that the criticism that this movie deserves still,
the first one, yeah,
no, both of them,
both
as a whole, yeah, is that, and this is also why I watched the David Lynch movie again, is, the David Lynch movie is not successful in how it portrays the narrative. There's that whole history of, Dino De Laurentiis making that film, and Jodorowsky wanting to make his version.
Good documentary.
Of it.
You guys should go watch
Ridley
that.
Scott wanting to tackle the IP and so on and so forth, and eventually David Lynch being the one making the film. That's 2 hours and 19 minutes, and it incorporates the basic sort of plot points and beats that you would expect within Frank Herbert's Dune, and being an adaptation. It's not completely successful by any means. And I think one of the biggest problems with that movie is that it kind of does portray Paul as a hero. And it's also coming at a point where Star Wars was just so successful in the 70s that every studio was trying to buy up science fiction
Sci-fi,
properties up until, the end of Star Wars, which was Return of the Jedi in 83. Dune came out in 84. And so you were seeing...
And ironically, Star Wars inspired a little bit by Dune, right?
Absolutely,
Like,
yes, yeah. And so that, it's full circle in that way, in the same way that, you have the full circle nature of, the prophecy being told within this. But you can see the fingerprints and the imprint that Dune has had on so many science fiction stories, whether they be film, television, other novels. And so that influence has always been a big part of it. Obviously, someone like Isaac Asimov has always been a very influential person. Philip K. Dick, talking about Blade Runner. All of those guys kind of are major influences within the world of science fiction, heady science fiction, psychedelic as well. There's a big part of the book of Dune that feels like, okay, it was made at a time of, Frank Herbert smoking the herb,
some spice. Yeah.
And so like that 60s influence is there, especially with some of the colors and sort of the design, and Denis Villeneuve brings that into both of his films, or his one movie. But if you're looking at it as a whole, we just had Killers of the Flower Moon come out, which is, 3.5 hours long.
Mhm.
There could have been a version of Dune that was that long. It might not have included everything that both halves have, but at least it would have been a full sort of experience in one movie. And I think that that's the biggest criticism, especially when Denis Villeneuve is recently talking about, how television is monopolizing filmmaking and changing the vocabulary of it and being more exposition based. Well, it's a little hypocritical of him to say that, because television also has influenced the way that things are divided. You look at the televisual landscape of
how this movie's divided, right?
You look at the Avengers films, you look at the
serialized
Hobbit movie,
storytelling, right? Like
the Hobbit movies.
Yeah.
We didn't for a Hobbit book that's like this. Why did we need 3 movies? We didn't. It's just milking.
People expected that too from the Lord of the Rings movies.
Yeah, but the Lord of the Rings were individual books, right?
Yeah.
Where the Hobbit is one little children's book,
and to your point,
a novella.
They made 3+ hour versions of each of those books, and then sometimes made 4-hour or 5-hour versions of those books. So why couldn't you have done that here? I agree with you on that. So let's get into it. Let's talk about Dune Part 2, and then we'll talk about, obviously the movie as a whole. So Eric, you've seen it twice now, and I know you just talked a bit, but I'm going to kick it back over to you. Since it's fresh in your mind, you saw it 2 nights ago, you've seen it twice now. So, and you're coming as a hater of Dune to now,
which is very funny because I grew up loving Dune.
I know.
In college, reading the book, I've read Dune and Dune Messiah. I kind of checked out after Dune Messiah.
I tried reading some of Messiah. We'll get to that at the end of this. But,
Children of Dune, I never got to, and I never got to any of his. I think his kids wrote some of
he
other
wrote
novels.
6 of them, and then his son wrote like 10 more or something.
Yeah.
So
got to keep it in the family. Got to keep those sandworms in the family. So Dune Part 2, I think the strongest aspect of it, as I already mentioned, is that there's actual progression in the plot. Characters are proactive. Things are happening in this movie. Zendaya is in the film doing things. She's not just simply a fantasy that we occasionally see in interspersed dream sequences. And so with that, we're seeing the game of Dune, the way that the chessboard was set up in the first one, is being played
out.
It is finally, there's movement, there's character work, there's a sense of humor that actually is surprisingly welcomed within the narrative, especially coming from Javier Bardem's character Stilgar, who I think, in my opinion, is the MVP in this movie acting wise, because a lot of people will be talking about Austin Butler's sociopathic Fade Rotha.
Rebecca Ferguson too, dude.
Rebecca Ferguson's great in it as well. And I
Yeah.
think most of the sort of like going back and rewatching it, the thing I really appreciated on a second viewing was someone like Dave Bautista's performance. It's not necessarily showy in the way that I mentioned with Butler, or funny or memorable like it with Rebecca Ferguson or Javier Bardem. But the thing that I really appreciated on a second watch is he's willing to show vulnerability, but also be pathetic and weak. And thinking about what he does in Dune Part 2 is something that, say, The Rock would never do. Ever. We would never see The Rock kiss somebody's shoe in a movie.
Maybe now, because he's on the downward.
I don't know. I still think that he wouldn't grovel in any way whatsoever. And so watching that, I was like, oh man, Dave Bautista really has become
Oh, he's great.
this great character actor, and he's seeking out interesting roles instead of just simply, movie star action hero parts. And that's what's really exciting about this as well, is that it plays with expectations and chooses people for roles that maybe you wouldn't expect them to be in. I think, very much the narrative structure of it is a little bit slow at times when you're rewatching it, because you know what's to come, and I think you're anticipating certain things. So when you're watching it and maybe you have a moment where you think to yourself, oh, we haven't even gotten to Fade Rotha yet, or we haven't even gotten to this moment yet. So that's where you begin to feel the length a little bit. I think the second time you watch the movie, where there are certain things where it's like you're creating kind of sort of like a way to kind of divide the film up in a way where you're like, or chapters within a part 2, where you're like, oh yeah, this hasn't happened yet. We still probably have like 20 or 30 minutes. But the other thing that I think is really important here is that Paul Atreides is not a savior. He's not somebody that is truly here to liberate the Fremen. He feels he has that nobility and that he wants to be a part, of this culture, of this society, and ingratiate himself along with his mother.
Yeah.
But at the same time, his bloodline, his birthright, his need for vengeance fuel the strategist side in him. So he's more dueling with the savior and strategist sides of himself throughout the story. And ultimately, where it ends, I think Denis Villeneuve, throughout the entire film, has been telling you that you should never put all your prospects into one person. Like, even though Paul, compared to some of the other people in this narrative that are playing for power, is probably the best choice within the moment.
Sure. It still doesn't mean he's a good choice.
No, his motivations are self-centered.
Yeah, exactly.
And he doesn't have the people that he wants to culturally appropriate and be a part of their interests in mind.
No, it's ultimately about him, like you said, whether it's this revenge or for, this history that he's bought into, the smell of his own bullshit of House Atreides and his birthrights or whatever. Like he finally buys into all that kind of shit, and I like that progression of character, and that's what you're saying that was kind of missing. It was, oh, okay, are you there? You're gone. Power went out. Well, we're back after 30 to 40 minute little intermission. Maybe that's a sign that all movies, especially of this length, should have an intermission. My power went out. You might have seen that in the video. In the audio, it might have been a little harder to tell. But yeah, randomly, we're getting a little bit of crummy weather here today. It's a little bit warm for February in Toronto, but it's like rainy today, so the power went out mid-episode. I forget kind of what I was talking about, but I think we were talking about Paul's character arc and how, now that you have part 2 and part 1, that works much better now that you have two halves of the same whole. I don't know if I went into my actual thoughts, but like, I we've talked about it for now 20 minutes on this show already, that I've done a complete 180 on Dune Part 1, and I think that really helped watching Part 1 immediately the night before and having an intermission of 8 hours sleep in between before we got up and watched Part 2, because I think without it I would have been completely lost again. The movie does not hold your hand at all, much like the first film. It does not give you a previously on Dune and then like a recap or exposition or
It
anything.
kind of does a little bit with
Uh,
Florence Pugh kind of giving you
sure,
the
a little bit of, because
talking
it's
about
traveled
the
through the.
fall of the
Yeah,
Atreides
exactly.
house and stuff like that. And that's kind of what even David Lynch's movie did, where the beginning of that film has this prologue of Virginia Madsen playing the princess, and she talks about
Sure.
all the houses and why
It delivers a
the
little bit of exposition.
yeah.
Yeah. But it definitely, I think, I said this about the first film in the review with Kind of Funny as well, that Denny's one of those guys that it doesn't really hold your hand. He trusts his audience to either get it or not, or he just doesn't care if you don't get it. And the point, and I think more directors and more filmmakers and more teams need to kind of trust their audience, because I think a lot of the times the hand holding and spoon feeding of information and just bad exposition and ADR and all that kind of stuff to over explain things is is horrible, and especially in big Hollywood movies. So I think what I love this movie. I really do. I love it as one gigantic whole. I find it like you mentioned, Eric, as ironically what Denny just said about TV, but movies are becoming more like TV's becoming more like movies. We've said this for a long time now, especially in the serialized storytelling, very much in the part ones, part two, in the franchise filmmaking, all that kind of stuff. So even when you see this film and you're seeing, oh, it's part two of the first book of Dune, it still very much feels like part two of a larger story. So I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about that later too, of maybe being a negative or just how, filmmaking is now and stuff like that. But I do see it as, you know, television on, and I don't mean this as an insult, I mean it as a compliment, on the most gigantic scale you could possibly do. Game of Thrones has a gigantic scale. There's many other TV shows that have huge epic stories told out and get more into character and things like
But
that.
it's
But I
long
mean,
form in comparison
exactly.
to a
Where
feature.
I find this long form in the sense of that they feel like episodes of television or seasons of television in 3 hours. um and because it's so serialized, and that this does feel like a complete arc for Paul from part one to part two, it still feels like Denny's playing the long game here and going, I trust that people are going to enjoy this. I trust that it's going to have its hardcore fans. I trust that a regular movie going audience is still going to buy into this. Maybe they won't get all the intricate 3D chess that's being played, but like they will get this overall Messiah story, whether for better or for worse. Of we can debate what Paul's doing, but I really think that it still feels like this is part two of a trilogy. People comparing it to Empire Strikes Back, all this kind of stuff, which is the obvious kind of, of course they are, part two of a sci-fi space movie, but with a depressing, story by the end of it. But I just think Denny's scope and scale, like this movie is fucking gigantic, like in every sense of the word. Like it's massive. And that can be from a filmmaking perspective with the cinematography and the score and the visuals. I think it's massive from its storytelling in the sense of everything that's going on, of like Eric said, like that 3D chess that's being played out that was set up in that first film is really being executed here, and then setting up other things for the future. I think the visual look of the movie I like even more than the first one. My big complaint about that first film that I still kind of have is that I know it's intentional, because most of the movie takes place on Arrakis, which is just fucking sand. Like there's not much you can
It's
do, but it
rough,
has
it's
this,
coarse, and it
it
gets in
gets
everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah.
But even the buildings and this kind of, the style of the movie and the way the ships look and the buildings look, it is that kind of, you know, gray, hard edges, like everything kind of looks similar. There's not a lot of color in that first film, and this film, I guess, is in a sense the same, but I like the juxtaposition with the Harkonnens' home world. Is it Getty Prime? And like the black and white cinematography used there and how it transitions into that, and how massive all that looks, and give a little black and white as a treat. I think the new additions to the cast, I agree with you that they're not necessarily new additions, but I will say MVPs are Rebecca Ferguson and Javier Bardem. But I love Florence Pugh. I think she's perfect. Christopher Walken. I love seeing Christopher Walken, a guy who's become almost a parody of himself, right? Kind of in like that Nick Cage territory of like, you can never really take him seriously, but you forget that he's also a great actor because he's become this kind of caricature and a larger than life personality that, because of the way he speaks and things like that, that it's Christopher Walken. And I think the further you get away from some great Christopher Walken performances, the more you just see that caricature. So when you see him as the Emperor in this movie, I think he absolutely crushes it. He's used just the right amount. Like, he's not in a ton of the movie, but I think he's perfect. You've already mentioned Bautista. Leia Seydoux is great. Even Austin Butler, who I know we both don't really like, I think he works as Fade Rotha. Like, he's in that kind of Jared Leto territory for me, where I'm like, I don't like him, but in certain scummy kind of roles, he sort of works, and I think he worked in this. Like, his accent comparing to Elvis, you hear a little Elvis in there, but you
Especially
hear
when he says
Stellan.
emperor. When he
Yeah,
says
but you
emperor
hear some
comes out.
Skarsgård too, where I think that stuff really works. Having Zendaya be more of a central focus in this movie, um, I think she's good. She's still not my favorite. Even Timothée Chalamet, ironically, like the two main leads are probably like my least favorite in the cast, right? Like Chalamet as Paul, like I know he's supposed to start out as this, kind of, Duke, young kid. I think he's in his teens in the first movie, right? And he's supposed to be a kid, and I think his rise, Chalamet does a good enough job, but there's still something about him that I don't know if it completely works, but I still think it's executed very, very well. I think there's more action in this film than the first one, which I think is a good thing. It helps the story move along, and it helps actually some of those more complicated, intricate, storytelling and things like that. I think it helps move that along. Um, and yeah, man, I was just completely enamored. I think these two movies put together um, are one of the most massive piece of filmmaking like ever created. Like, I just think the scale of it is unmatched in anything else you'll see, whether it's in a sci-fi film or just blockbuster filmmaking. It's something we talked about off air too, Eric, that love it or hate it, what Nolan and Denis Villeneuve and some of these guys are doing that have risen from their indie filmmaking status to these massive, gigantic Hollywood blockbusters, but they still retain that sense of I'm gonna do what I want, and that whether it's auteur theory and any of that shit, you can argue all of that. But what I love is that singular vision, and that studios, Warner's not doing great stuff lately, but at least with something like this, they're giving him this big, heady, complicated, dense sci-fi franchise and let him do his thing. They let him cook essentially, and like and cook he did, because I think it's executed so well. I think all the hype about it being one of the best sci-fi movies ever made, I think that can, it's hard. Recency bias, all that kind of stuff plays into it, but it is really that massive. And I think that conversation is valid. I think it's too early to have that conversation, but I think that conversation later, after people sit on it and talk about it, and especially when he's done making, whether he makes Messiah or Children of Dune or passes it on to someone else, like I definitely hope people, you know, buy into this, and I hope we get more of it. And I absolutely loved the movie. I thought it was fantastic.
Denis Villeneuve has retained the grain and he's put it back into the sands of Dune.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, he's one of those filmmakers where I think you know, it's fascinating when you have the conversation of what is his best work, because there's a lot of people that maybe have seen Enemy, which there's a fun little not that it's a reference to the film, but it's sign language that says enemy at one point very early on in the film, with Jake Gyllenhaal, where that might be the closest they've come to seeing a Quebecois film of his,
Sure.
Polytechnique and Maelstrom and things like that. So, going into this, like, a lot of people haven't seen any of his earlier work.
No,
Maybe
they've only
starting
seen
at
his Hollywood stuff, right?
yeah, probably starting at either Enemy or Prisoners.
Yeah.
I think Arrival is still my favorite of his works, just in terms of bringing it all together, in terms of what he's capable of doing, or doing. But what I love about this movie is, you mentioned the scale and the scope of the grandeur of it all, but he's able to still ground elements in sort of the intimacy of human life, and sort of the relationships that these characters have, and their devotion to religion, or to an ideal, or something that they believe is bigger than themselves, and how that also divides people. Because looking at it again like a game of chess, you see factions within the Fremen as well, where you have people that believe right away that Paul is the chosen one, that is the leader to come and bring them to paradise. And then you have people within the same commune that aren't believers, that he is an outsider, he's a foreigner, he is someone not to be trusted.
Yeah.
And we also see that in a sort of larger scale, that the North is a little bit more present, they're more contemporary, they're near industrialization, and
they have
sort
to
of
deal with the Harkonnen and all that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
and even dealing with the Atreides before. So they're a little bit more adjusted to the going-ons of the universe. They've seen a little bit more, where the South is barren and kind of a wasteland, and all this fundamental group are their faith and their thoughts and their belief that something better will come. So, like, that's even interesting. And I do agree with you with Timothée Chalamet. Like, I think his performance is fine, but there are a couple of moments where he's supposed to come into his own in a similar way to, like, say, Al Pacino in The Godfather, where we see Michael Corleone kind of at the beginning of that movie kind of rebel against his father and not wanting to be sort of incorporated into that life. But then slowly but surely, as his father is nearly assassinated in that film, he becomes sort of the new Godfather, where at the end of that movie, you really buy Pacino becoming this adult. He's matured over the course of a film. Where with Timothée Chalamet, there's this weird thing of, like, being a kid in his dad's clothing. Still, that feels
very
a little
boyish,
off,
right?
And I don't feel like he commands the same kind of respect that Pacino does at the end of The Godfather. Not that I'm doing a one-on-one comparison, just in terms of, like, seeing a character start from one place and then by the end of the narrative become somebody else completely, and feel like, oh, over the course of this narrative, we really have seen a drastic change in who he is. It's more so the movie telling you that. And Zendaya, I also feel, I think I like Chani more so as the character, because ultimately she's the one you should be rooting for. She's the one who is always steadfast in her ideals. She believes that basically the Freemen are communists, in a way. They talk about the idea of doing everything for the sake of everybody and not just the one. And her devotion to her people is what keeps her going, in terms of why she is fighting the fight. And it's not just simply to help Paul, it's to help her people. And so that I really do appreciate, because it makes you realize that what happens in the third act is maybe even more, not tragic, but devastating in terms of what she goes through. But yeah, her performance it's fine. It just kind of feels like a little bit self-aware at times, especially in certain reaction shots that the character has. And she, even though it's a science fiction story, there is a part of it that feels almost like an old school narrative, and she's a very contemporary actor, and so is Timothée Chalamet, where it doesn't necessarily fit as well, where I kind of feel like Bardem and Ferguson and Josh Brolin and all these people kind of are more integrated or naturally integrated into this kind of almost biblical epic on the scale of like a Ben-Hur or Lawrence of Arabia,
Mm-hmm.
where we kind of understand that, these kind of are the um legendary actors, and obviously, there's a Shakespearean element to it as well. You mentioned Christopher Walken. His performance very much reminded me of King Lear, where you have somebody that's been on the throne for so long, and he kind of wants his daughter to take sort of, the steps in order to become the next empress, and he's kind of curmudgeony and surly in his ways, but he never has to really exert his own efforts in order to get anything done. And that's like the ultimate sort of display of power, where you never show any weakness or sign of fear, and you are basically in complete calm, cool, collected control. And that's what Walken does so well. And it's just also just funny to think that Walken, was in the Fatboy Slim Weapon of Choice music video, which references Dune, walk without rhythm, you won't attract the worm. So, like things like that, where like I'm sure that wasn't like the main reason why Denny cast, Christopher Walken. You always get an actor,
Yeah.
Jose Ferreira was, the emperor in Lynch's version. I think what Lynch's version also, you talked about this before, where Denis Villeneuve isn't spoon feeding you. Lynch's version is, or the theatrical version is, because a lot of that film, Dino De Laurentiis and the producers, and whether it was through test screenings or things like that, they didn't have faith in the material.
Yeah.
And so they felt like, okay, well, people are coming into this that don't really know what Dune is. And this is back in 84, so there was a little less time between 1965 and now. So you had a lot of ADR of people explaining things, or like I mentioned, the Virginia Madsen prologue, where she is like staring at the camera and being like, Arrakis, also known as Dune, is the place that
Yeah.
everybody
But you
wants
got
to
that a
go.
lot,
And
and I
these,
think in sci-fi, like Blade Runner, the
yeah.
original cut too, with the voiceover and
And
shit
then
like
Ridley
that
Scott
too, right?
re-releases
Yeah.
it as the director's cut,
Yeah.
which kills all of the voiceover narration
Yeah,
by
because
Harrison Ford, who didn't even want to do it to begin with. And you can tell in that voiceover, it's just kind of like, oh, almost apathetic in the way that it's delivered.
and I'm not saying audiences now will fully grasp this, which is why I think, we're a testament of, or me specifically, I'll speak for myself, of that. If you don't get it the first time, I urge you to maybe give it another shot. And because it is dense and there's a lot going on, and it might not just be your thing either. And it's not, that's totally okay, because it is, you know, a lot. And I tried reading Dune Messiah, which I won't talk about at all, but I got 20 pages in and I'm like, oh my God, okay. Like there's a lot of terms thrown at you that aren't, they're made up terms and made up people. And it's just you can kind of, once you really think about it, especially in these two movies with part 1 and part 2, kind of assign how you want to remember things and how you see that 3D chess playing out and who's actually controlling it and what the Bene Gesserit want and what the Emperor wants and what the Harkonnen want and how that's all playing together. But what Paul wants and what the Fremen want and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot there, and then it gets even more and more complicated as you go on. But um yeah, it's definitely not for everyone, but I think even if you go in and just know the simplest thing of Paul's journey, the rest of the stuff you can either, what I love about it and on rewatch is that you can follow the simplest form of the story and maybe you just don't get everything else, and then they don't spoon feed you the rest of it. But you can go and read more about it, get the lore drops online, read the books if you want to continue. It's like there's so much there that if you want to know more of it, it is there. And sure, that's secondary, reading and other things after you see the movie. But I kind of like that too. Like it is such a rich, like they've done such a good job with the world building, I think, in the first two movies, in a way that feels intelligent and there, of course, it has exposition and things like that, but I think they've done a good job of making you want to know more, but giving you enough information to be intrigued throughout. And I think that leads into kind of what Villeneuve, it seems like he wants to do another one, right? Like it seems like he wants to do Messiah at least. And I know we're getting the Bene Gesserit show later this year, which I'm shocked is actually
Benny
happening. But
Gesserit's and the Jets,
yeah.
Elton John song.
And you see stuff in this movie very much like part one, where he's setting things up. There's actors who are only in one sequence. There's, even you could argue with Florence Pugh being the almost in the Zendaya role in the first movie of, she's in more of it, I guess, but she does very much set the film up and then show up kind of closer to the second half and the end of the movie. And it seems like it's more set up for her character than anything, right? So it is playing this, like I mentioned earlier, this long game of really going, I hope this works because I want this to be a franchise that continues. And
Well, even if
that's,
she becomes a character in the Bene Gesserit show, because she mentions being a pupil of the Bene Gesserits, and you could
yeah, but
kind of
that's
do a
10,000 years in the past or something
but you
like
could
that.
build
Like,
up to it though,
yes,
right? Like you
exactly.
could,
Yeah.
if you do multiple seasons of a show, you could take place in like
You could
different
jump
centuries, right?
5,000 years. Yeah, of course. And like, that's where you could set up, Lady Jessica and just all
A younger
even,
emperor.
yeah,
And also
Charlotte
the one thing that this
Rampling and stuff
doesn't
like that
do,
too.
that the Lynch film does spoon feed to you, and the book does tell you a little bit more, is some of the motivations to why the emperor basically betrays Duke Leto. And that's partly because Leto,
Isn't he like gaining power because he's
well,
so
yeah, because
likable or something?
Leto's power is growing partly due to his approach to being an emperor. He's more, as Walken says in the trailer, that his father was weak because he has a heart, and so
Yeah,
he's trying to become a leader for the people. And that's why the emperor is basically going to
scared of him, right? Yeah,
sabotage him,
yeah,
assassinate him, and sabotage and kill off that bloodline. But what it also doesn't really get into too deeply, and maybe this could happen in the Bene Gesserit series or another spin-off series if they decide to go down that route, is kind of explain a little bit more into detail the relationship that Leto had with the Emperor, because it's almost father son like in a way, and it's almost like the Emperor felt betrayed by Leto in terms of Leto becoming more popular, and you even see those kind of dynamics between how you know family members sort of use their children as pawns in this game as well. You see Ferguson kind of fanning the flame of fanaticism for Timothée Chalamet's Paul, but then you also see Stellan Skarsgård's Vladimir Harkonnen or Harkonnen, basically baiting both of his nephews into sort of taking over Arrakis and sort of pitting them against each other, but also against him, but kind of being like the silent partner and wanting to become the emperor and doing it in a way that's nefarious and what you'd expect from a character like that. So there's all these power dynamics in play. And the other kind of interesting thing about this movie is that the spice melange in the first one is very pivotal to the universe and whoever owned it's like in Scarface, when you have the spice melange you have the power. And then
yeah,
with this, it's there, but because you're seeing it from the Freeman's point of view, the most valuable thing to the Freeman is water.
yeah,
And so like the way that they cultivate water um can sometimes be very disturbing,
yeah.
but at the same time it shows you like what different cultures, what different groups value over others. Like the basic life necessities for the Freeman are water, food, religion, um their people, where the industrial side of it with, you know, the Atreides, with the Harkonnen, you know, with the Emperor, like all of this thing is based on, you know, profit and power.
And just
And
how important that's, but I do agree with you that the movies don't like it's clear that it's a very important resource for the entire galaxy, right? Like, but you don't really realize that like none of these people can basically function without it, right? In the entire galaxy. It's like, I think, isn't it how like the Bene Gesserit get their kind of
yeah,
abilities? It's how you use interstellar
transportation.
travel. It's how it's like literally it's what makes
It's an
everyone
addiction.
work. Yeah, and if without it the whole galaxy would crumble, right? Because everyone's addicted to it or everyone needs it for their particular abilities that they have, that without it, everything would, you know, go to shit. So it's almost like this necessity, and that's what you get, this very nuanced, intricate, you know, plot. And it doesn't necessarily, again, spoon feed you any of that. You can go back and read the book and get more context or look it up and things like that. And I'm sure as we get into Messiah, if it happens, which I hope it does, that they'll go into all of that.
I don't think that's going to be
Um
Denny's next movie, though. I
no,
honestly think,
he
like,
says he's writing it. He's talked about it.
sure,
So
I think actually he's almost finished writing it, or at least like
yeah.
he's at a place where he kind of feels like at least a first draft is done. But the thing is, you know, Denny spent so much time on this one movie that I remember him talking on the Roger Deakins podcast, where he was saying that it would just be nice to make something that you don't have to build an entire world from scratch, where you can kind of just go in and make something that maybe is a little bit more, you know, cut and dry. Where, yeah, he's built the world of Dune now, and, you know, has set it up for, you know, future adaptations, and maybe to bring on filmmakers that he's interested in seeing their take on it when he kind of eventually leaves, because he's also got films like Cleopatra and Rendezvous with Rama. And if he does Rendezvous with Rama, that is also, I mean, Arthur C. Clarke is another, you know, sci-fi author whose work is so heady and dense and strange that when, you know, you read the plot synopsis for that, you think to yourself, okay, this is something that could only be made if you have the cachet to do it, because it's not something that, you know, a first time filmmaker or somebody that has a great vision for it can just simply, you know, walk into the studio and say, I want to make this. Because there was a time when Morgan Freeman bought the rights to the film version of it, and he wanted David Fincher to direct it, and it just never happened because it was just so much of an undertaking. So you know, maybe he wants to do that, but that's also a film that'll probably take years to make and design, and sort of, you know, contemplate the philosophical and also the sort of more practical elements within the genre. So maybe he tries to find something like a Sicario, or something like that, that's a little bit more on planet Earth in the meantime, you know, and or something smaller. But, you know, you look at like what Nolan's talked about recently, where like he's afraid to kind of like go back to do something that's indie, because he's been working so long in this sort of blockbuster hemisphere that he's afraid that, you know, if he goes back, he'll never be able to return, because it's so hard to get to that point. um
But
and
I think I said this to you off air too when we were talking, of being like, they're at this point now where even the smallest thing they do is still going to be massive. Like,
Sure,
I think
absolutely.
like,
But like, think about Nolan doing something on the scale of Memento again. You know, like that's not going to happen.
yeah, that's what I mean. Like, I agree that I think no matter what, like, I think Oppenheimer is as close you're going to get to something like that, right?
Sure.
Like,
No,
and it
I
still
agree with
cost
that.
$100 million, and it's I think no matter what they do, it's going to be on a gigantic scale, even if it's a smaller, more intimate character story or something like that. Like, I'm with you. Like, I'd like to see more directors do something, you know, smaller, give them $50 million. You can still do like a small movie
Or
and
even
give them a good budget.
$100 million, which doesn't seem
Yeah.
that much
Which
anymore for
is,
these
yeah,
guys, you
for
know, like,
Oppenheimer, that's what Oppenheimer
or the
is.
Prestige.
Oppenheimer,
Like,
yeah.
give Nolan the budget that he had for the Prestige to do something like that. Like that, I'm sure wasn't a small budget, but when you look at the Prestige now compared to his other films, it's very modest in terms of
Oh,
its
totally.
its storytelling.
And in
you know?
Denny, for like, if we get a Prisoner's an Enemy or a Sicario from him, like I'm 1,000% down for that, right? But
Yeah.
since Arrival, he's been doing these gigantic sci-fi movies, which is fine. I love them. Like I love his aesthetic. I think he's one of the best filmmakers working today. Proud that he's
He loves your
Canadian. Like,
shoes.
yeah, it's something I forgot to bring up too. Yeah, like I've had 2 interactions with Denis Villeneuve. Uh, One, I interviewed him for Enemy. Oh, there you go. Thank God we're celebrating this with some balloons. He complimented my shoes in an interview that I did with him for Enemy. Super nice man. You can probably still find that interview. I wanted to clip it out, and I'd probably be embarrassed, man, if I watched any of those tribute
Well, you've
interviews
also
now.
interviewed Leah Seydoux, so
That was the same year. Don't go watch that. Please. I was very like, it was my first ever gig with tribute that year at TIFF, but like I remember loving Enemy and I loved Prisoners as well. Same TIFF. So I interviewed him for Enemy. He complimented my shoes. Then remember when we saw First Man at TIFF,
oh
and I
yeah.
sat beside him the whole time, and I wanted to vomit during that movie. Because
I
we were very close.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah. I met
IMAX footage,
him
not great.
once for the Critics' Choice Awards when he had Arrival there, and one of the producers who I interviewed on the red carpet at the after show, was kind enough to introduce me to
Yeah, I
him,
remember you telling me this.
and we talked briefly about Arrival, but we also talked about Maelstrom, about because that's the other thing about Denis Villeneuve movies is that you can always count on him to have weird
Oh
sort of
yeah,
sort of
talking to something or
animals that are kind of
yeah,
like sort of distorted or creepy. So we talked about the talking fish in Maelstrom for a little bit, and
yeah,
it was kind of nice, like talking about like the CBC at in an LA event. So
yeah.
yeah, so it's like stuff like that where uh he's all like I think Blade Runner 2049 I like more than the Dune movies as a whole.
Yeah.
And I think he kind of nailed the tone of that film and the world building that was already presented by Ridley Scott, and you got the sense of like he knew what he was doing with kind of playing with the mechanics of what worked within the canon and what wasn't canon, because that's also tricky with something with Blade Runner, because it's like, okay, well, what's going to be acknowledged and not acknowledged because of the director's cut, the theatrical cut, the final cut,
Yeah.
like all these versions. So with that movie, it just felt like this was something like he was born to make, because obviously Ridley Scott was a huge influence on his own work. With the Dune films, I think like part 2 or the second half of this movie is a much more kind of exciting experience, and usually I don't mind, like I've always been a
Setup.
fan. Well, I don't mind like it talking about slower movies or films that
Yeah.
don't necessarily progress plot, because plot isn't necessarily my main focus when I watch movies. It's usually like the last thing. But with something like this, or like comparison to the Lord of the Rings movies, I out of that trilogy, my favorite is the Fellowship. I like all of that world building. I like the camaraderie
Interesting.
with the characters. I never felt that with part 1 of Dune. I never felt the camaraderie, maybe with the exception of Jason Momoa, but there wasn't really, it just kind of felt like it was a machine that was setting things up to get to this film.
Yeah.
And so once we get to the second half, it's like, okay, well, the groundwork is done. Let's now move on to tell the story. Let's get to where this story is ultimately going. And it does. And it's very successful in that way. And, you know, Ridley Scott and Martin Scorsese and guys like that are making those kind of movies now, or still making those movies, those films that are $100 million movies, aren't going to be around forever. You know, they're in their 80s now. So, you know, you're reliant on Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan and directors like that to continue to make these kinds of films, these, you know, large scale productions that have a certain effect on you when you're watching them theatrically, when you're watching them in an IMAX theater. I think,
It
you
doesn't
know,
just feel like a content farm, right? Like
no, it
that's, I
feels like an
think,
event. It feels like, okay,
yeah.
this is why you go to an IMAX screening of something,
Yes.
because that's the best way to see
Oh,
Dune Part 2.
absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
you get the full majesty of what is coming out of the screen and what Villeneuve intended, and it feels like something that you would have, like, your parents would have watched when they saw, or your grandparents would have watched when they saw Lawrence of Arabia the first time. Or, you know, the closest comparison now to us would probably be the Lord of the Rings movies, where,
I
you know,
agree.
the
Yeah.
first time you watch those, you realize, oh, this is what, you know, the big screen experience can do. Because there's nothing wrong with watching a movie at home, you know, on a good sound system, with a good sound system and a good screen. You know, I know Paul Thomas Anderson's talked about that, where, like, a lot of films you kind of almost come across in the days of cable, you would find things as programmed on Turner Classics or
Sure.
Space Channel or something like that. But when you see something like this presented in a way that's made for,
The
you know,
theatrical
the theatrical
experience. Yeah.
experience, you understand why, you know, a filmmaker like this does what he does, or she does, or they do. And so, you know, you appreciate that more. And I think we appreciate, even though we didn't like Dune the first time around, I think the one thing we both said is that, you know, we understood, like, why a movie like that is being made. And it's
Oh,
just,
totally.
it's also just unfortunate that a filmmaker like Denis Villeneuve, even more so than Christopher Nolan, probably still has to fight a little bit more to get things like this made, even when they're successful. Because even though Denis Villeneuve's working on Dune Messiah, it hasn't been
No
officially
guarantee.
greenlit
Yeah.
yet, right? So it will. Let's be real. It will, because
It
it's
will.
going to do
Yeah.
well.
I
Like,
think it'll do better than the first movie. I have this weird feeling it's gonna have that Oppenheimer effect, or that kind of, not necessarily maybe Top Gun Maverick or anything like that, but I do think it'll be that movie
Tom Cruise on a worm.
that'll perform pretty well its opening weekend. It has a huge budget at almost 200 million, but I think the word of mouth and, you know, people going, you have to go see this in a theater, people comparing it to one of the best sci-fi movies ever made, comparing it to Empire Strikes Back, comparing it to whatever,
And it
and
only
just
being
saying,
available in the theater, because that was the
yeah,
other thing
with
that
the
was
first
different, is
one, yeah.
that the first one was, you know, the beginning of HBO Max, which is
And
now
we were
just
in a
Max.
pandemic still too, right?
Yeah,
Like,
so now the only way to see this movie for the time being is theatrical. So there's no day and date window of opportunity where somebody can just watch this at home. They have to go out. So it probably will make exponentially more money because of that.
and I think we haven't, like, I'm sure this, we don't need to get into award stuff. It's too early, but we
It
did
will.
technically go to an award screening of this. Yeah, and I think that's where that comparison to the Lord of the Rings movies, I feel like, you know, it is big budget Hollywood blockbuster filmmaking from a former indie director that is on such a gigantic scale with this large scale storytelling with a bazillion characters and things like that. And it's equally applauded by, you know, regular moviegoers and critics, and like it's almost something that like brings everyone together weirdly, even though it's like this dense heady. I think this is more complicated than Lord of the Rings, but also if you're not into fantasy, um Lord of the Rings could be hard to follow and hard to, you know, keep up with and stuff too. So I think that comparison is apt, and that's why I see Messiah, like, even if I really do think this movie will perform well, but I do think that they envision it as this trilogy, and that they'll make Messiah, and then after that, maybe it gets passed to someone else and they continue with Children of Dune and anything like that. But like,
And
um,
Messiah will be the true test, because if people think that this movie is esoteric or hard to
I know,
get into,
yeah,
Dune Messiah is so cerebral.
and
It
it makes
is,
Paul even more unlikable too, right? Because
yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's the
because
whole
even,
point, right?
yeah,
Like,
and the intro of the book even has from Frank Herbert's son, like doing like an apology, being like, well, not an apology, but like being like,
context, right?
when this first came out, people hated it, and well, it's, don't worry though, Children of Dune is great. It's like, well, okay, and I think it was reappraised afterwards, right? Much like a lot of these things, even Blade Runner and other, you know, sci-fi
I
movies that
hope
people
that
go,
Bradley Cooper gets to play Frank Herbert, and then
yeah,
cries on a couch with his actual children there.
right.
Because yeah, no, Dune Messiah, like, I
No
got
spoilers.
I,
Let's
no,
not
I
like,
got through
yeah.
it. No, I'm just gonna say I got through it when I was in high school, but it was such an arduous reading experience
Yeah.
that it turned me off completely from going into Children of Dune. Um, so it's weird. That film is going to be really interesting to see how and if Villeneuve can crack that material, because it's alienating in a way that it makes the hero even more antagonistic, but also some of the imagery is harder to explain without explanation or
Yeah.
exposition, and you kind of have to go with it as more of a vibe than necessarily analytically sort of breaking it down. And it's
Yeah.
the same I mean, Children of Dune has that as well, but it's like Children of Dune kind of feels like it's almost like, okay, let's wipe off the chess table and start over
Start
again a
over.
little
Yeah.
bit.
Like a soft reboot. Yeah. Kind of
Yeah,
thing. Of like,
but that's interesting as well, because you look at how Dune has been adapted over the decades. The TV movies, the TV miniseries,
series. Yeah.
the Lynch film, the even it never happened, but watching Jodorowsky's Dune, the documentary, and seeing what Jodorowsky was going to do, and then Ridley Scott talking about it in the Dark Days Blade Runner documentary, that that's the movie he wanted to make before his brother passed away, and then when he kind of came back, um, he went with Philip K. Dick's Even Androids Dream of
Yeah.
Sheep. So yeah, so it's one of those things where I think this is the most commercial version of this material
Oh, for
you'll
sure.
ever
And
get.
even then,
And even then, it's not
yeah.
going to be everyone's cup of tea. And I think even the people that like this movie as a whole might have a hard time with what
With
Dune
Messiah.
Messiah is.
Interesting. I'm gonna try to get through the book, and I'm excited, and I hope this continues
Are
because
you
I
ju- are
really
you
do.
are you just reading it, or are you going to do an audio version?
I originally was just gonna read it, but I think the audio version might help me.
Yeah.
Because I found myself rereading. I did do that too, and it didn't help because it was just made me go. I like just blinked a bunch of times and had to reread paragraphs, and then I'm like, it starts with a interview with a historian, an in-universe historian talking about it, and then it goes into an excerpt from something the historian wrote, like a textbook, and then I'm like going, it's just like, and there's throwing out all these terms and words, and I read some to Nevis and in bed, and she was just laughing because I was like, what the fuck does this sentence mean? And like I was like, and I'd read her a sentence and she's like, that is a lot. And I'm like, yeah, it's a lot. I had to put it down after 20 pages, but I want to get back to it. Anyways, let's end here. It's great. You should go see it. Watch part 1 and part 2 back to back. I know it's like a 7-hour commitment, but I really do think it's worth it. I wish we could go more into detail, but we're trying to keep this, spoiler free as possible. Like I mentioned, if you want my spoiler filled thoughts, I will be on In Review, Kind of Funny's In Review this Friday, 6:30 Eastern, 3:30 Pacific, if you're a member over on Kind of Funny's Patreon or YouTube. It'll be up on podcast services and YouTube Friday night at some point. And I'll be talking full spoilers with Nick, Tim, and Kevin about the movie. So I'm very excited for that. I'm going to give this film, now that I've seen both halves, I'm reviewing the whole film in this. And I've gone from 2 stars for the first half up to 5 because I can't have people hate me. No, I'm kidding. I just actually genuinely really really love the movie now, so I'm gonna give it a 5.
You
I think it's
drank the
great.
water of life, and you are
Yep, that blue
glow.
Kool-Aid, that blue
Your
warm
eyes are
Kool-Aid.
glowing blue,
Yeah.
and you're ready to sniff that spice and hang out with the Herberts. Hanging out with the Herberts. Yeah. So if I'm looking at this as a whole film to give a rating for, I'll probably give it a 4 out of 5. I honestly think the second half is superior, and actually, and I don't mean this because you're going to hate me, Matt, for saying this. I think that this is, as a whole, is better than the Avengers movies, and that Denis Villeneuve is a better filmmaker than the Russos.
Well, I mean,
But
I'm not gonna argue with that. I mean,
I think, like, what
I
I'm
don't
looking
think
at
you
it
can
from the
compare like
comparison,
Infinity War Part 1 and
no,
and
But what I'm
Endgame.
saying is that I think I found more to focus on in Endgame in terms of character development, again,
Sure.
motivations, plot, like it moved forward, where Infinity War felt like it was also a lot of table setting. And so
Part 1s feel like that, man. Deathly
yeah,
Hallows Part 1 I think is awful. And I think Deathly Hallows Part 2, because it's the payoff, is great. So like
Yeah.
it's, I don't know.
Yeah, and The Hobbit 3 is amazing.
Yeah.
So I'll give it 4 out of 5 just because I think like that first one, while I appreciate it more within the context now of watching it as a whole and seeing Villeneuve's version of Dune, there is still something where the second half I think is stronger than the first.
Cool. Well, thank you all for listening or watching. We really do appreciate it. Please go check out our Letterboxd, which is Untitled_movies. You'll be able to find all of our podcasts and reviews, especially our guest appearances, anything up there, as well as our ratings, our most anticipated films of the year list. You can go back and listen to that podcast on this channel here, but you can also look at the Letterboxd list. We also have a review up right now for Drive Away Dolls you guys can check out, and we'll have more reviews in the future. It's starting to ramp up a little bit now that we're at the end of February. I feel like what Dune
Charlotte
is kicking.
Rampling? Ramp up?
There we go. Put your hand in the box. So we're gonna rampling up for the rest of the year. It's kicking off with Dune Part 2, and then it every couple weeks we'll probably have a big movie now. Like it feels like we make this joke every year that the summer movie season starts early and earlier. So we'll have I know it's a little bit of a slow start to the year, but we'll be having more reviews very, very soon. We'll also have a new episode of the Untitled Movie Podcast, the main show. Eric and I are going to talk about like vacation spots you should go to and places we've been before if you're a movie fan. That'll be a blast, so keep an eye out for that. And as always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at untitledmoviepodcast.com, and you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
Yeah, and you can find more of my work on rogerstv.com/cinemascene. There's also an interview coming up with Deanne Whalen right here for 500 Days in the Wild. And as Matt said, like it does seem like each and every week there is a new big movie coming out, and we're only in March. So buckle up and get ready to go because the spice is life.
Until next time.
Wiggle your grandfather worm and head over to IMAX and see Dune Part 2.